It's no secret that the American elite holds a massive amount of wealth, but just how much? Where is that wealth located? And where does it all come from? While this subject is incredibly controversial, you can't fully understand wealth without knowing the answers to these questions. Hi guys, and welcome to Ponder on That, where we dive deeper. So let's start with one seemingly simple question. How rich is the American 1%? As usual, we need a couple basic definitions first. The main, somewhat objective organization tracking American wealth statistics is the Federal Reserve. To measure net worth, the Fed clusters Americans into 5 groups based on their income. These are called percentiles. So according to the Fed, the bottom 20% of Americans are those with the lowest incomes, and the top 20% have the highest. Simple enough, right? While this is useful, it's important to remember that wealth is not the same thing as income. Income is the amount of cash you earn every year. It could be from your day job, a side hustle, Social Security, or any other regular payments you receive. Wealth, or net worth, is a measure of someone's assets minus their liabilities. In other words, it's the total value of the things they own, like houses, businesses, and stocks, minus all their debt, like mortgages, student loans, or credit card debt. What most people think of when we say rich is someone with a high income and a high net worth, but people often have one or the other. For example, if we look at wealth by age group, currently the boomer generation controls the majority of American wealth, but that wasn't always the case. Back in 1989, the silent generation was the oldest generation around at the time, and they controlled most of American wealth. And we could see that change playing out over 40 years. What we're seeing is the older generation dying off and the next generation behind them moving into retirement. Now, the majority of wealth is typically held by the elderly because they've accumulated a lifetime of savings. They probably own their house, and that house is likely appreciated in value. They've got full retirement accounts and plenty of stocks. Of course, being old doesn't make you wealthy by default, and most elders aren't rich, but the statistics show that most wealthy people are old. On the other hand, older people, especially in retirement, might not have as high incomes. For example, if you own a house you bought in 1950 for $16,000, and today it's worth $600,000, you're very wealthy on paper, but your income may be fixed as you slowly withdraw from your retirement accounts and Social Security. So if the Fed is clustering people by income, you would fall in a lower percentile even though your wealth was quite high. This isn't enough to totally wreck the data, but it's something to keep in mind. With that being said, now let's take a closer look at the 1%. As of November 2023, the Federal Reserve says that the top 1% of American income earners have a net worth of around $35 trillion. While staggering, this number isn't really that useful by itself. Constant inflation over the past 50 years has technically raised the net worth of every American income percentile, but we all know those dollars buy far less than they did 50 years ago. Just look at what houses were selling for in 1950 versus today, even when adjusted for inflation. Instead of focusing on the raw numbers behind net worth or historical comparisons, we need to compare net worth between income groups and compare that to overall economic growth. This chart breaks Americans down into percentiles based on income and shows how much wealth each percentile has. You'll notice the top percentile, 80 to 99%, is 1% smaller than a standard percentile. This is because the Fed separates out the very top 1%, giving us a 6th separate group. As a percentage of all private wealth held, it looks like this. We can see that the 1% is represented by the dark green color. They control about 30% of America's total wealth here. This is more than the red, yellow, and most of the dark blue, or the bottom 50% of Americans combined. However, you'll notice that the 80th to the 99th percentile, or the top 19%, actually controls the largest share of American wealth. It's important to keep in mind that this group has much more people than the top 1%, however, this is where a good chunk of American wealth resides. If we take the top 39%, or the 60th percentile to the 99th percentile, we can see that this is where the overwhelming majority of American wealth lies. Although the discrepancy here is less stark than it is between the 1% and the bottom 50%, because this also represents about 40% of the American population. If you're wondering, to be included in the 1% by income, you would need to earn approximately $820,000 a year. This is nothing to sneeze at, but lots of normal jobs could realistically reach that salary. Skilled professionals like doctors, software engineers, lawyers, and successful small business owners could all fall into this category. You probably interact with someone making this much money pretty regularly, and you wouldn't even know it. Even within the 1%, the variation is gigantic. If we look at the very top of the 1%, the 0.01%, it's a whole different animal. The individuals at the top of the American 1% are worth at least tens of millions of dollars, and this exclusive group contains all of America's billionaires. This is probably a good time to pause and look at just how different $1 million versus $1 billion is. If you're in the top 50% of Americans by income, you could realistically expect to see $1 million in your lifetime. If you worked hard and saved diligently, this is not an unrealistic sum of money. Indeed, the goal for a typical middle-class American to retire is to go into retirement with approximately $2 million in assets. Compare that with the upper levels of the 1% though, and you see how truly astronomical the difference is. If we look at the difference in net worth between the richest person in the 1% and the poorest person in the 1%, that difference is larger than the richest person in the bottom 50% and the poorest person in the bottom 50%. Politically, it's much more interesting to compare the very top of the 1% versus the bottom 40 to 50%, but that's not actually where the real story is. Even if we exclude the 1%, the top 19% of Americans by income control the majority of Americans' wealth, and they have for a long time. On the other end of the spectrum is the bottom 50%, who controls a minuscule 2.5% of America's wealth. More interestingly, this number has barely budged since this data started being collected in 1989. As far as income inequality is concerned, the 1% has almost nothing to do with it. It's really a story of how the middle 40% is losing ground to the top 20%. The bottom half of American income earners were never really in the game in the first place. This is probably a good time to pause for a very important caveat. Unfortunately, the Federal Reserve only has data going back to 1989, so historical wealth comparisons are incredibly difficult. Older data is less reliable and is much more subject to the bias of academic researchers. However, there's ample historical evidence showing that in all societies, regardless of economic or political system, inequality waxes and wanes, but more on that in another video. Now, me telling you the rich are in fact rich isn't exactly news, but where's all that wealth located? This may seem like an academic detail, but any explanation or solution to wealth inequality hinges on it. When we think of wealth, we often picture a giant pile of cash or a bank account with dozens of zeros behind it. After all, wealthy people must be sitting on huge piles of cash, right? Well, not exactly. The majority of the 1%'s net worth is tied up in two major assets: stocks and private businesses. As this chart shows, stocks make up the bulk of the 1%'s net worth at a whopping $17 trillion. This is followed by a distant second, private businesses, at $8 trillion. If we take public businesses, aka stocks, and private businesses, we could say that the vast majority of the 1%'s wealth is in business. The next biggest chunk of wealth is stored in real estate, valued at $5.73 trillion, followed by other assets at $6.6 trillion. I put other assets last, even though it's higher than real estate, because it's a vague category. It can include annuities, trusts, cash life insurance policies, educational savings accounts, mortgages held for sale of real estate, and amounts due from sale of businesses or properties. However, it also includes things like retirement accounts and durable consumer goods. It's fair to say that the 1% probably isn't relying on their retirement accounts to get them through their old age, and durable consumer goods are an annoying category that I'm not super fond of. They're expensive things that last a while, like cars, but I don't really even bother valuing them because these assets pretty much always depreciate and are very hard to objectively value. Knowing what the ultra wealthy own is actually much more important than how much of it they have. Let's take stocks for example. The top 20% of Americans together own the vast majority of stocks in the US. In other words, they own the overwhelming majority of public and private American businesses. And business is the engine of economic growth. Now, in the short term, stocks can be very volatile. That's why it's important to ignore sensationalist headlines about all-time highs in wealth among the rich. When stocks go up, so does their net worth. When they crash, like they did during the Great Depression, the rich get wiped out and can become poor overnight. However, in the long term, stocks typically go in one direction, up. While individual companies may rise and fall and recessions come and go, the economy as a whole has steadily grown over the past few centuries. If you hold a diversified portfolio of stocks, then that growth lifts you a very little effort on your part. On the other hand, if you don't hold any stocks, then you're missing out on all that growth. Holding stocks is like paddling downstream. Your income is your paddle, and you're trying to move towards increasing your net worth. That stream, the economy, is pushing you along. Your income is your paddle, and your long-term goal is to reach a higher level of net worth. The stream itself is the US economy, and by holding stocks, you're able to capture the momentum of that stream pushing you along as well. If you don't own stocks, on the other hand, you're paddling on your income alone. At best, the stream isn't helping or hurting you, but as inflation dilutes your income, you're actually losing wealth that's sitting in your savings account, forcing you to paddle even harder. Without stocks, it's almost impossible to keep up. This pretty much explains why the 1%'s wealth has continued to grow at an ever faster pace. More stocks means more growth, which means you can buy more stocks. Pretty soon, wealth becomes exponential. For every other income group, real estate is the largest store of wealth. While better than nothing for preserving your wealth against inflation, real estate has many issues. It's much harder and more expensive to buy and sell real estate than stocks. For most people, the only real estate they own is their house. Chances are they have a mortgage and they need to pay that every month, which reduces their cash flow. And that house will need constant maintenance as well. If they sell it, they may get a lump sum of cash, but they'll also need a place to live. Of course, real estate doesn't necessarily go up in value, and in many places it can permanently crash. Oh, and don't forget taxes. Even on vacant land, you have to pay yearly taxes, and any buildings you own require insurance. Even real estate that generates cash flow, like rental properties, requires either hands-on maintenance or expensive property management, and has plenty of other expenses. Most people are lucky if they break even on their houses after we adjust for inflation and considering all the cash they spent on the mortgage, interest, taxes, insurance, utilities, and maintenance. Worse than real estate is durable goods. For the bottom 40% of income earners, durable goods are almost 20% of their wealth. I don't even like calling durable goods assets because they all depreciate. Like real estate, durable goods cost you cash in taxes, maintenance, and insurance. Unlike real estate, however, there's zero chance of them going up in value. While you might be able to sell your car for some cash, every day you own it makes it worth a little less. Eventually, it will be worth nothing, and it will cost you cash all the way down. Unfortunately, stock ownership among most American income groups has declined, with ever greater amounts being held by ever fewer people. This has some interesting implications about how and why our society works the way it does, but we don't have time to discuss that today. Putting all this information together makes it easier to see why the wealth gap exists and what it looks like. Historically, no matter the country, government, or economic system, the poor have always been incredibly poor, and the rich have always been mind-bogglingly rich. The only thing that ever really changes is the size of the middle. Now, I know you're probably ready to run out in the streets and start rioting, but let's remember one thing. If this was an easy problem to solve, you can be sure we would have already figured it out by now. Despite what politicians and activists might hope, the problem is messy, and simple ideologies won't fix it. There might not even be a solution at all. At the very least, you can clearly see where the wealth is, where it comes from, and who has it. And knowing that is half the battle. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and even if you disagree, I at least hope you found it thought-provoking. Be sure to leave a comment letting me know what you think. If you did like the video, consider helping the channel grow by liking, sharing, and subscribing to ponder on that. Until next time, thank you so much.